In this video, I want to look at the appealing to tradition fallacy. The fallacy is pretty straightforward in that we reason from the fact that something is a tradition to the conclusion that we should perpetuate or continue that particular tradition. The form of the fallacy is as follows. You take a tradition or habit or custom or long-standing practice, and it doesn't really matter what it is, but let's call it phi. And then we point out the fact that it is a tradition, and we reason to the conclusion that we should continue this particular tradition. So we should continue phi. The argument is invalid because the premise one, that something is traditional, can be true, and the conclusion, which is that we should continue the tradition, can be false. To see how this could be the case, we can think of all sorts of things that have been traditional or that are traditions that we can agree that should be immediately stopped, or that is, are bad traditions. So you can think about slavery, female foot binding, maybe female infanticide, maybe beating people into a gang. All of these things may be traditional, but I hope we all can agree that these traditions should be stopped rather than continued. But we can actually make this particular argument valid by adding a missing premise. So go ahead and pause the video and think about what that missing premise might be. Okay, welcome back. The missing premise is that everything that has been the case should continue to be the case. That is, we should always continue whatever traditions that are out there or that we have. But premise 2 is false. There are a number of bad traditions. That is, things that might have been traditional that we think we should stop. Just to throw out some more, there are, let's say, fighting animals, bullfighting, dog fighting, cockfighting, all that, any kind of one animal versus another animal, we'd say, man, maybe this isn't a good practice, even if it isn't traditional. College hazing or any kind of hazing where you beat someone into a gang or tease them or harass them to a way that causes some type of psychological or physical damage, we would say, yes, it may be a long-standing practice, but it's one we should get rid of. And then maybe various forms of traditional gender norms. The man should be the primary breadwinner, the woman should be the homemaker. Okay, so now let's look at some examples. We'll walk through some cases where an individual commits the appealing to tradition fallacy. The first one involves universal basic income, or what's sometimes called UBI. And so let's say someone proposes the fact that we don't need to work anymore, or not everyone needs to work. Instead, we should offer a universal basic income of $1,000 or $2,000 a month. Let's say this is a proposal. Someone might respond by saying, well, it's an American tradition to work. Everybody needs to work. Here they're committing the appealing to tradition fallacy and responding to the proposal of UBI. Just because it's traditional to work doesn't mean that we should continue this tradition. Maybe things have changed. Maybe technology has reached to a point where we can all sit back and relax. So just because the fact that we have been doing this for a long time, grinding away in factories, doesn't mean we should continue to grind away in factories. A second example might involve the workplace. If you've ever had a job and you thought of a way to do something in that job better, you might have proposed this, and more often than not, you'll get met with the following response. Well, we've always done things this way, and so we're going to continue to do things this way. This, again, is the appealing to tradition fallacy. Just because something is traditional, or just because you've always done something some way, doesn't mean you should continue that tradition, or just doesn't mean you should continue doing things that way. People make advances, learn how to make the workplace more efficient, and using this appealing to tradition fallacy is just a way of keeping the status quo or being conservative or blocking progress. If you are part of a family, perhaps you have various traditions. Maybe you shouldn't continue all of those traditions. Let's say your family always eats ham on Christmas, and you don't like ham. And so your family might say, well, we've been doing this for 20 or 30 or 40 years. We've always had ham on Christmas. But if most of your family is vegetarian and the rest of them or most of them don't like ham at all, maybe they prefer different meat even if they aren't vegetarian, just because you've always eaten ham doesn't mean you should continue to eat ham. Another example might involve religion. Let's say you have a religious practice Let's say it's the practice of male priests. So the Catholic Church has male priests. There are no female or women priests. And so an individual might say, well, we've always had male priests. Jesus had these apostles who were male priests. And so we're going to continue that practice. Well, this looks again like the appealing to tradition fallacy. Just because something has always been some way doesn't mean it should continue to be that way, especially if there are good reasons why a different practice would be better. So I could go on all day giving examples, but I think it's time now to turn to some reflections. So the first reflection I want to commit is more of a speculation as to why people might commit the appealing to tradition fallacy. I think one of the reasons that I think people might commit it is because they have a rosy view of the past. They're sentimental about past experience or past events, or at least they remember the past as being pretty pleasant. And so if the past is really present and they look fondly upon those family traditions or various practices that occurred in the past, they want to push that goodness forward. They want to push that positivity into the future. One thing worth noting, though, is that people's memory of the past, at least from an experimental point of view, is flawed. A lot of times people inhibit negative memories. So if something bad happens to you, you stub your toe, you try to forget that as quickly as possible. And you try to forget all the memories associated with that stub toe. Whereas you try to definitely remember the details of positive memories. So you try to keep those at the forefront and not forget all the good things that have happened to you. There are maybe two explanations as to why this occurs. One reason that's put forward by some of the psychological literature is that people have a pretty positive self-image of themselves. And so you're more likely to remember all the good things that you've done. You want to maintain this positive self-image. So you're going to say to yourself, I'm a good person. Let me list off all of the good things that I've done and kind of forget those negative things. And so you'll remember the good things and forget those bad things or inhibit those bad memories from popping up. Another is minimization. People try to minimize the negative experiences in their lives. They don't want to maximize the pain and suffering more often than not. So if there's a painful memory, the process of minimization or this adaptive process, you're going to try to make it lessen. And this is to some extent a good thing. If you've had a horrible relationship that you want to get over, it helps at some point to forget about some of those details that really hurt you so you can get on with your life. The second reflection I want to make is more of a reminder that just because the appealing to tradition arguments are fallacious doesn't mean it gives us a reason to throw out those traditions. So just because you can point to someone who upholds or holds on to a particular tradition, and the reason they hold on to it is because they commit this fallacy, doesn't mean the fallacy is not a good one. So going back to my first example, the first example was that every American should continue to work because we have always worked in the past. We have this long-standing tradition to work. But just because this commits the appealing to tradition fallacy does not mean the conclusion that we all should continue to work is false. There may be good reasons why we all should continue to work. It's just the fact that we've always done this in the past is not one of them. Let me give you a kind of extreme example of this. I had a friend who in high school said the 24-hour day where you're awake, 16 hours of the day and asleep 8 hours of the day just doesn't work. It's just a tradition. And so since it's based purely on long-standing practice, let's get rid of it. I'm just going to live my own life based upon a 32-hour or 36-hour day. So I'm going to stay awake for 24 hours and then sleep for 8 hours. Well, this worked for him for maybe a day where he was awake from 3 a.m. to 3 a.m. and then slept from 3 a.m. to 8 a.m. But it sort of started to break down after a while because there were periods where he was awake from 8 a.m. to 8 a.m. And then what is he going to do? Just sleep all day during class? The teachers wouldn't permit this. So he found out the hard way that this tradition is held onto for a reason. The last thing I want to insist upon is that the appealing to tradition fallacy is different from status quo bias. In the case of status quo bias, what we do is have a preference for whatever circumstance is currently the case. And so if you run every single day, this is a practice that you had, then you want, in terms of the status quo bias, you want to continue that process of running. In the case of the appealing to tradition fallacy, what we point to is some long-standing practice and say because this has been the case for a long period of time, we should adopt it or continue it into the future. So to see how the two differ, imagine that you are a 20-year smoker. You smoke for 20 years.
I don't fret when it's rainy and wet or sizzling hot and dry.
And then you take a break from smoking. You say, I quit smoking and I've been off cigarettes or whatever tobacco you use for a year. Well, if you commit the status quo bias, then you'll say, well, the current state of affairs is such that I'm not smoking and I'm just going to default to the status quo. I have a preference, rational or irrational, for my current habits or circumstance. In the case of the appealing to tradition fallacy, however, what you would do is point to the long-standing habit or tradition of you smoking. Hey, you've smoked for 20 years. Keep on smoking. And you would point to the fact that because you've been doing this for a long time, you should maybe start up this practice again and smoke into the future. So thank you very much for watching. If you have an example of the appealing to tradition fallacy, I'd love to read it in the comments below. I always think that these fallacies are kind of funny, and I'm amazed how many people are able to identify the fallacy in different contexts, ones that I never would really consider or thought of myself.